Good morning. We start our second day of the conference. It's my great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the organizers. And today we have a keynote speech by Jay Rouel, who is in Director Mark Blok Center in Berlin. It's a very important center, as you know. He will talk about economic liberalism, migration, and liberal democracies. What happened to the promise of liberal democracy in Europe after 1989? We start 5 minutes late. Sorry for that, but okay, it's your floor.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, excellent. It's truly a great honor for me to have been invited here for the keynote, and I wanted to thank Alexander. I wanted to thank the organizers as well for the welcome, and I especially wanted to thank the public for the first day, because I learned a lot of things about different aspects. I get new viewpoints because I'm, for the most part, evolving in a Franco-German context, and so it's been very enriching for me as well. I'd like to start perhaps by, as has been the case, it's been mentioned, this conference is important not only because of the 35th anniversary, but because of the rather monumentous election in the United States of last week. We have again a hegemon, the United States, with an America First agenda, with a policy of sealing off the border. We talked about that yesterday with the symbolic questions of the physical nature of the border. But we also have someone who has a policy towards Russia and Ukraine, which we also talked about yesterday, which will perhaps have very important geopolitical effects on the millions of Ukrainian migrants already in Eastern and Western Europe. And so this is probably a moment when there's some kind of electroshock, which perhaps needs to take place in Europe to address some of the older tensions, which I will try to address in my talk. In my talk, I'll be trying to link together economic and political liberalism. It's been a lot the talk of political liberalism. We haven't much talked about economic liberalism, and I'll try to link it through migration to the overall topic of the border. The great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu always made it a point to recall that in the social sciences, the speaker, that is his or her experiences, trajectory, is always an essential starting point. With the topic we're dealing with, first-hand experiences of borders of the Iron Curtain, for example, are essential, as are the country in which one was socialized. I'm still part of a generation that was socialized before, while the wall was still an essential part of a worldview, and which academic discipline we're coming from, which are essential to take into consideration on what is being said. I was born in Germany. I grew up mainly in the United States. I did, however, have strong family ties to Western Europe. And my experience with real existing socialism came in Leipzig in the August of 1989, when I signed up for a German course because I was curious about having a look on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I got a taste of the seriousness of what the inter-German border meant when I took a night train from Frankfurt to Leipzig. And I noticed that my fellow passengers, who were very chatty, suddenly became silent about 30 minutes before we hit the border. When we reached the border, we strictly obeyed a 20-something-year-old border agent who barked orders, who checked every passport. We had to show our profile from the face. And so I got a first taste of the seriousness of this border. I then spent 3 weeks in Leipzig, became friends with many East Germans, and several weeks later I returned to my US-American campus in my second year at university, and the Berlin wall fell. I went to several conferences at my home university to try to see what academics were saying, and the message was that it was the duty of academics, Americans and West Europeans, to teach the East Europeans all about democracy and help them set up capitalism and democratic institutions. At the time, I already found the viewpoint a little bit arrogant, given that East Europeans had freed themselves through peaceful revolutions with a lot of creativity, without outside help. And in the following years, I was often very annoyed by the fact that East Germans, including my friends, were somehow labeled in the Western media by West Germans as somehow having been stunted by communism, lacking in initiative, having authoritarian characteristics, and were somehow less modern. My interest in East Germany remained, and I did my thesis in France on GDR housing policies in the late 1990s, where I tried to question the ontological divide between liberal democracies and totalitarian states by working on policy expertise, knowledge instruments, and street-level bureaucrats. In the mid-2000s, I went on to European studies, where the integration of new member states was always a central question, and I also taught for several years a course on the transition in East and Central Europe. So much about me. Oh yeah, I just wanted to mention as well that I was part of a collective project in the late 2000s on ordinary perceptions of Europe, in which we did in-depth interviews with Poles, French, and German ordinary citizens from all social classes. And what was interesting, where the Polish citizens were different, was that many of them, not all of them, saw the EU as another type of outside influence, did comparisons to the Soviet Empire, something that limited their newfound sovereignty. And contrary to the French and the Germans, they could imagine the European integration as being eminently reversible, because they themselves had just experienced a system that seemed in place, unthinkable that it could be any other way, and history had other plans. So to circle back to Bourdieu's advice, in a nutshell, I've spent the past 30 years in France, the last year in Germany, had a brief but decisive experience with real existing communism, spent several years working as a historian, but then as a sociologist on Europe and on the GDR. And my work in Europe was at a time exactly when the hopes, so from the 2000s, I would say, where the hopes, the high hopes of the 1990s were starting to turn sour before being in the position that we are in today. Through my socialization and experiences, I'm better equipped to discuss evolutions in Western Europe, itself quite heterogeneous, but I will try to make the effort to look at the evolutions in kind of a mirror between East or Central Europe and West Europe, and I will do my best to deploy this double perspective. I want to circle back now to the theme of the wall and start with an anecdote, because it ties quite well into the general theme I'd like to develop on, and the accent I wanted to place on migration. The freedom of movement, whether it is for tourism or for work, is one of the great conquests of the fall of the wall, separating the economic and political systems of the Cold War. The great physical boundary has, however, been replaced by other types of filters and boundaries, but also legal and economic, and also depends on what type of passports one holds. In 2016, I woke up one morning and noticed that my British passport, which was my only passport, had suddenly lost quite a bit of value, and since then I've become a French citizen. Anyways, to start on the anecdote, I initially wanted to travel here to Sofia from Berlin by train, conscious of carbon emissions, and I also wanted to take the opportunity to spend perhaps a weekend in Budapest along the way. Getting from Berlin to Budapest was no problem. A night train, 14 hours, get in, get out. However, getting from Budapest to Sofia looks like this. 25 hours of time to achieve the remaining 600 kilometers, with 3 changes, including one at 3:40 in the morning in a town that I've never heard of, some walking distance between stations, and an absolute nightmare. So I thought maybe I would just take the train to Budapest, spend the weekend, then get up on a plane. However, there were no direct flights from Budapest to Sofia, so I would have had to fly back to Munich, to Vienna, or to Frankfurt to get here, annulling any carbon gains I could have made. So this is the first lesson, which feeds into my general thesis, is that the asymmetric clout which structures the EU today distorts the space-time continuum. In other words, it's very easy to get from Sofia to one of the financial hubs, economic hubs in Western Europe, much easier than to get from Budapest to Sofia, which, after all, are 2 capital cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. And so this is already something that shows the structuring, the attraction, the pull of the economic hubs and the edge or peripheral situation of the other countries discussing. But this isn't the only area. I won't go on to into this, but in media coverage, for example, in the generalized press in the West, we only hear about Bulgaria, for example, when there's an election, and the only thing we hear is someone pro-European or anti-European elected, which doesn't bring us very far. Same issues with language. Very few West European elites speak any type of Eastern language unless they have themselves something in their family background, which some type of migrant status. And this is just the contrary of most of the people here in the room. All of you speak English, obviously. And I would suggest that many of you also have an excellent mastery of a second German or French, and many discussions I've had proved this. So structurally then, these different small questions, the ease or difficulty of travel, the language imbalances, the interest in media, is quite revealing of these types of structural, which are also economical, political, but the political and the economic go hand in hand, as I would like to, the point I would like to make. More worrying is the slide into illiberalism. Some of these things, travel is inconvenient, but it's not a question of life and death. But more worrying to me is the slide into illiberalism, which can be charted both in the new member states, starting in 2010, but there were signs earlier, but also into the old member states. Since 2010, many of the West considered that it was a mistake to have allowed Central European countries in the EU or into the EU so fast. For federalists, for example, many present in France, the increased heterogeneity and difficulties in coordinating policies for 27 countries seemed to be an obstacle for deepening integration. For others, the authoritarian turn in Hungary and Poland were interpreted as a sign of ingratitude, a sort of stab in the back after having benefited from so much EU funding by rejecting the democratic acquis communautaire. However, in the past 5 to 10 years, and there have been warning signs for a lot longer, there's been an equivalent turn to illiberal policies in the West. Brexit and the Tories, for example, sending asylum seekers for treatment to Rwanda, but also Italy having fallen to the far right, others threatening, and there's been a general hardening of laws curtailing many basic freedoms. In France, for example, emergency laws put into place to fight terrorism have been integrated into the general, ordinary law. And in Germany, there have been renewed controls at the border and deportation of asylum seekers to pleasant countries like Afghanistan. So there's a general crisis, not just concentrated to the east, as many in the west sort of, again, rather arrogantly assumed until the mid-2010. And of course, there are many different explanations to this, sort of global explanations, which Jan discussed yesterday, which I won't go into. So the after effects of September 11th with all the turmoil in the Middle East, the terrorist attacks, the migratory pressures, the geopolitics of a rising China, and others cite the dualization of economies with winners and losers in this globalized setting. The argument I'll try to make is that we have to rather look, or one of the pieces of the puzzle which are often not discussed, is look internally to Europe for the main reasons, or for some of the reasons. And in my perspective, many of the tensions that exist today can be linked back to decisions made in the early 90s that put the EU onto a track, onto a course in which resentments and mutual fears could only prosper. In the East as well in the West, as the power asymmetries, which I just discussed, the economic asymmetries, the unleashed forces of capitalism in context of liberalized economies, set into motion a series of economic and social dynamics which pitted Europeans against one another, leaving a bitter aftertaste that has been translated in voting booths all across Europe. So how did we get to the current state of affairs from the very optimistic and hopeful early 1990s? The early 1990s were marked, of course, by the fall of the wall, that's obvious, but also great strides in the European integration project, through the Single European Act, the Treaty of Maastricht, the creation of the euro, a current currency, and hopes for the triumph of liberal democracies. To understand the, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. So yeah, I come to my first argument. the first argument is that it was not liberal free market democracy which proved itself to be superior to communism, but rather a form of capitalism tempered by state regulations, protective labor laws, high taxation, economic redistribution, and a high level of welfare protections. We go back to the 1980s, a decade which is remembered today as the liberalization decade, the Reagan-Thatcher supply-side revolution. One can indeed have the feeling that the liberal turn had already taken place at the moment of the fall of the wall. However, aside from the United Kingdom, with Thatcher's offensives against labor unions and the liberalization, the so-called Big Bang of 1984 of capital markets, the historic post-war compromise between labor unions and between labor and capital was still largely intact, even though some of the support, some of the underpinnings were gradually eroding. In Germany, Helmut Kohl had made a few minor liberalizing reforms in the 1980s. In France, François Mitterrand did come back on many of his electoral promises in 1983, but for the most part, European economies can still, at the time, in 1989, be qualified as being largely redistributive with a balance of power between capital and labor, ensuring a sharing of growth and profits, with capitalism being channeled and controlled by workforce regulations, progressive taxation, high capital gains tax, and organized labor. This economic organization was underpinned or had three foundations in the post-war Western European period. First, big companies had compromised themselves during the war in collaboration. Companies such as Renault were nationalized, IG Farben was broken up. Banks, insurance companies, and key industries were nationalized or were distrusted also following the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s, when liberal capitalism seemed to have been a factor feeding the rise of Nazism and fascism. Second, there was a fear of communism and systemic competition, which made it important to integrate the working class into the post-war economic boom. After 1989, of course, this fear no longer existed and had effects in the West. And third, unions, social democratic and communist parties were powerful in many countries and could engage conflict with ownership and win. Welfare states were strong and cemented the post-war consensus. A good indicator to show that liberalism actually occurred post-1990 in much of the West is this ratio of salary gains to productivity gains in Germany, West Germany, and then unified Germany. As we can see, the two curves are absolutely correlated, showing that there is a capacity to share productivity gains. And this curve only started diverging in the early 1990s at the moment of unification, which weighed to some extent on public funds to invest in new infrastructure. But also, this was the moment when the Single European Act took place, which freed up and liberalized a lot of exchanges. Germany was famous for its economic model, or economic miracle, in the 1950s to 1970s, and was undoubtedly, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the country that was the most visible for East and Central Europeans. It was a country where living conditions were enviable, and this post-war model was still largely intact into the 80s and into part of the 90s. Another metric which reflects the tilting balance post-1990 is the tilting balance between revenue from capital and revenue from wages, or in other words, the increase in socioeconomic inequalities. In this graph, we see here that after a period in the early 1970s, which was the moment of the first oil shock, the bottom 50% managed to maintain about 25% of national income. The top 10% were somewhere around 30%, and the middle classes, the middle 40%, were around 40-some%. And what we can see, and this correlates to the graph we just saw earlier, is that starting from the early 1990s, 1995 being sort of a watershed, the the paths diverge. There are, of course, many factors at play here. There's a question of taxation, how different types of income are taxed, the ability of welfare state to replace income losses or for retirement, for example, the shift in the employment structure away from high-paying industrial jobs to lower-paying service industries, but also the increasingly profitable opportunities for people investing capital with the free movements of capital. So these are the things that tend to benefit an economic elite. And the point I'm trying to make here is that while there was some erosion in from the 1970s on in the model, basically at the time of the fall of the wall, the model was still largely intact, and it was this model that was sort of projected, which I think many East Europeans would hope would be their path in the decade after the 1990s. I don't know, I can say things about the GDR because I know that their West German living conditions were very well known for the simple reason that 60 to 70% of East Germans had family members in the West. So there were contacts, they heard about vacations, about houses they had. And there was also a certain amount of tourism. Many West German workers liked going to Yugoslavia, which was a relatively cheap vacation destination with beautiful coasts. And they would drive down there in, my uncle, for example, who's a worker from Hessen, he would drive down every year with a caravan and a sort of what's today an E-Class Mercedes as a worker. In any case, it was not this economic model which was sold to Central and Southeast European countries as the best way forward, but a low tax, low wage, and low regulations economic model, which was sort of had achieved sort of economic consensus amongst economists. So there were a shift in economic thinking at the time, and the experts and advisors who flooded the region had two central tenets, two central ideas, which mix the economic and the political liberalism. The first is that speed should be of essence. There was a fear of some kind of backsliding, a fear that the apparatchik would not relinquish control, that there would be some kind of facade democracy. And so it was important to wrestle control away from state bureaucrats and make regime change irreversible. The idea was to rapidly create an economic counter-elite, so based on this idea of civil society and a pluralistic elite, and privatize as quickly as possible. The fact that many of these economic resources privatized were captured by the former apparatchik didn't play a particular concern at the time. It was very kind of theoretical thinking, and the so-called shock therapies seemed to be the best way to link together political liberalization and economic growth. Central Europeans were told that after the initial shock, and the low-tax environment, skilled and educated workforce would be an attractive investment environment, and that prosperity would soon come. Second, this is a secondary point. Experts and advisors from this neoliberal thought, they loved being East Europe because they thought it was a tabula rasa. It was fantastic. There was no labor unions, no resistance, no competition, just people eager to learn. And they acted as if Central Europe was a tabula rasa with kind of one-size-fits-all approach, which I criticized in my course of the 2000s, but which I won't go into here. So East Europeans were made to believe that it would be a fast catching up, something resembling perhaps the German economic miracle. That was the hope. And as the graph shows, Central and, to a lesser extent, Southeast Europe have somewhat closed the gap from 1990 over the past 35 years. But the gap is still huge. The gap is still huge, and part of closing the gap, especially South European countries, is that South European countries have stagnated since the banking crisis. If one looks at the first decade, Poland, Slovenia, and Czech Republic took about 5 years to reach their GDP level of 1990. In Southeast Europe, in Bulgaria, it took about 10 years. And even if the current growth trends continue, and there's a flattening of the curve almost everywhere, but also in East and Central Europe, it's still a question of several decades, if ever. One small point I wanted to make was on the banking crisis or the economic crisis of 2008. And here again, we see the asymmetries at work in the European Union. So the crisis started as you know, the American subprime crisis. It became a European banking crisis, which then became a sovereign debt crisis as public institutions bailed out banks to save the indebted banks. And then it became a euro crisis, with all eyes focused on Greece for 2 or 3 years, with the summits of the last chance at every turn. What many West Europeans missed were the severe effects of the crisis on Central and East Europe. I think it's no surprise that Viktor Orbán was elected in 2010, because in Hungary in particular, where many households held bank credits labeled in euro, there was devaluation which caused a great deal of stress and hardship on many aspiring Hungarians who would aspire to property ownership, which was always an important question in Hungary. And so there was a general feeling in Eastern Europe, I think, of being at the mercy of events beyond their control, getting no attention from the European Union, who had all eyes on Greece, and the so-called pigs, Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Italy. And and I can understand that this was annoying because all eyes were on Greece, and Greece was the country that had profited the most from structural funds since the 1980s, to 4 to 5% of their GDP per year, much more generous support than what was benefiting the Eastern countries. The second graph is also quite well known. Here we're talking about employment. The transition, as we mentioned yesterday, had its winners and losers. There were great divides in geographic zone, age, and gender, with a huge decline in employment rates, particularly in Southeast Europe, and particularly among women. And one of the reasons for this, and one of the effects, is that this was something that would feed into migratory patterns as people thrown out of unemployment or in professions which were no longer in demand looked elsewhere for their livelihood. Just again, the East German context is the one I know best. Between 1990 and 1995, the workforce declined from 9 to 5.5 million. So almost 40% jobs disappearing. Many 1.5 million East Germans migrated to the West, and others, especially women, took on a role as staying at home, when in fact they had been highly integrated into the economy up till that point. Added to this, especially for Southeast Europe, a common agricultural policy of the EU promotes modernization, large-scale farming, and was actually a hindrance to many of the smaller subsistence-type farming, or subsistence plus some kind of salaried employment, on which people in Romania, I suspect it's similar in Bulgaria, but in Romania there's quite a large sector which again was put under pressure by EU regulations, which were actually supposed to help and support. So I'll just make a point, come back to the West. How did all this impact the old member states? Again, I'm trying to provide a mirror image. Again, the fall of the wall coincided with the implementation of the Single European Act, signed in 1986, implemented in 1992. And this had been negotiated in the context of 15 West and South European countries at the time, which had wide income disparities, but nothing compared to what we would see in the 2000s. These income disparities were compensated by generous and ambitious structural fund programs seeking to stimulate growth in Southern Europe. And of course, one of the difficulties is that the rich EU countries never agreed to go above the threshold of 1 or 1.2% of GDP for the EU, which, given that France maintained basically made non-negotiable the fact that the agricultural policy would stay around 40%, which has meant that there was just less money for Eastern structural funds to the East, given that the South also wanted to continue to benefit. So in the early 1990s, Jacques Delors wanted a stage 2 to the European construction, a social Europe, to flank the economic integration and the free trade zone. However, despite some hopes, there could be no consensus. The UK and the Netherlands slowed down the process, but also there was a general fear that too much national sovereignty would be lost over taxation and social spending, given that social spending accounts for about half of public spending in most West European countries. What came instead was the introduction of the euro, which definitively stopped nations from devaluation to reestablish competitivity and attractiveness. And there was also a strict enforcement of competition policy, meaning an end to state subsidies, seen as market distorting, the introduction of mandated competition in water, gas, electric utilities, in rail services, and caps on deficits and debts, which meant that the convergence of economies in the 27 countries to come was entirely left to market forces. In other words, states had their hands tied to do any type of proactive policies, and the idea with free competition that wages, investments would be drawn to the low-wage countries, employment would rise, wages would rise, and eventually there would be a general leveling up and approach and a leveling of the situation. However, this failed to account for market specialization. It failed to account for infrastructure advantages, industrial relations, and other indirect factors. And so actually Germany and the Netherlands, which are high-wage countries, actually got more competitive in the 2000s, and countries such as Greece, less so. European integration provided many opportunities for investors in multinational firms, limiting the ability of states to intervene. As Fritz Sharp argued in 2008, and I quote, "Globalization produces economic pressure, but it is the European integration process which has restricted or even taken away all legal means to react to globalization. Moreover, the Eastern enlargement has brought low-wage locations and other economic pressures inside the EU." See, time's running away, so I'll go quickly. So foreign investment did flow into East and Central Europe. As we can see here, Ireland and Luxembourg are quite high, but mainly because they're countries with holding and favorable tax status. But if you take them away, for the most part, the share of foreign-controlled enterprises in the non-financial business industry is the highest in the East, which also has the drawback of, again, having this idea of control, not being in control of decisions. And this fact had some quite profound implications for segments of Western societies, and that economic competition unleashed the disciplining forces of capitalism. The nation state was no longer seen as a sort of protective envelope, and workers were placed in competition with one another. In industrialized West European countries, in conflicts, the owners always had the nuclear option. They said, if you don't like the conditions, we'll go elsewhere. Bulgarians, Romanians, Chinese will work for a fraction of what you cost. And so the ability of labor to negotiate a compromise, negotiate a sharing of productivity gains was very strongly eroded. Ownership specifically pitted workers and nationalities against one another. There were a series of quite famous conflicts in France. Whirlpool, for example, moving its production site to Poland, where this type of competition was extremely visible and used as a cudgel. Workers in the West were made to feel overprivileged, spoiled, dispensable, vulnerable, not valuable, and this is precisely the types of things that political parties such as the Front National, such as Donald Trump, for example, could feed upon, is this idea of lack of recognition, lack of being an important member of society. This competition was redoubled in the 2000-2010 with the posted workers. Just one example, there are French shipyards in Saint-Nazaire. They're very proud because they built many of the world's huge cruise ships. And in fact, most of the work going there are posted workers, especially from Poland, specialized electricians and so forth. So there's little of these big contracts that are actually benefiting French workers. Politically, what happened was that the governing parties failed to take into account these types of fears, which created sort of ripple effects throughout society. It's a factory closure will maybe 1,000, 2,000 people might lose their job, but there's a ripple effect on the whole area and something that's in the public domain. Governing parties didn't take this into account for several reasons. First, the famous TINA. Angela Merkel said during the sovereign Greek crisis, there is no alternative, es gibt keine Alternative. The idea was that we can't come back on European arrangements, we can't come back on competition, a globalized economy, liberalism. You just have to work harder. You just have to get further education, and the rewards will come one day. So this provided a boulevard for political parties who said, we're listening to you, we're your champion. Second, parties lost much of their militant base. They didn't have their ties in unions. They became much more professionalized. A lot of politicians now had master's degree in political science or from Grande École, lived in urban areas. And so they had absolutely no roots to the small cities, to the urban, to the rural regions, and the regions that were left behind. And this again explains part of the result of the Front National, today the République, and just election results from 2017, charted on kind of a composite indicator of inequalities. On the left side, the votes for Marine Nationale, Marine on the right side, and you can see graphically quite a close correlation. Seeing I'm running over time, I can come back to things. East European integration also provided some winners. German companies, for example, had continued to be champion exporters. The made in Germany label is quite deceptive. Engines are often made in Hungary for Audi cars. Siemens washing machines, the final assembly is done in Germany. However, the point I want to make is that the high-paying jobs in engineering, in research, in marketing, in finance, corporate headquarters, and the profits remain in Germany, and the lower wage assembling being delegated to Eastern and Southeastern Eastern Europe. I wanted to come now to some questions of migration and demographics because I don't want to overrun. This is a map showing between 1990 and 2000, so over 30 years, demographic changes. One can see there are basically three factors which you can see on this map. One is different birth rates, but which actually don't play much of a factor here because the birth rates in the East or in the West are about the same as they are in the East, if not worse in some cases. The second factor one can see is the draw of big cities. So big cities are gaining in population. Rural areas are declining. We can see it especially in Poland, Moscow, for example. And the third important factor, of course, is the mass exodus flowing from the east to the west. And you can see there's actually, you can see the border of the Iron Curtain on the map demographically going straight through Germany, around the Czech Republic, Yugoslavia being especially bad, but that's due mainly because of the war in the 1990s. So in the East, there's an emptying of countrysides, a general demographic decline, and Ivan Krastev will, of course, talk about this in much better than I will. But of course, this provides ample opportunity for all types of tropes about great replacement, about if the populists speak in the name of the people, if the people are disappearing, the sort of idealized image of the multi-secular Bulgarian or the multi-secular Romanian, then of course it's very worrying, and it feeds into the types of tropes which can be easily exploited. Of course, here's another graph which shows the number of EU citizens that are usual residents in the rest of the EU. It's not corrected for population. These are raw numbers. So if you bring them into a relationship with population, it would be even more stark. And this doesn't account the UK. So there are still over 2 million EU residents, mainly from Eastern and Central Europe, who are in the UK. And so we see with Romania, for example, at 3 million, and these are just the official registered numbers. It doesn't account for posted workers or people that are coming for shorter times. These movements, of course, have something to do with the huge wage differentials. So if you just these are figures from 2023, so just between Germany and Poland, it's a 3-to-1 difference, and the difference is even higher if you take into account social welfare contributions. These movements also often concern younger workers, workers with higher education levels, workers with language skills, who often take up jobs well below their qualifications in the Western countries. If you have ever been to the United Kingdom over the past decade, you'll note that there's not a single person working in a car hire agency, most hotel receptionists, a lot of people working in restaurants are from Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, or Bulgaria, young, extremely hardworking, speaking several languages. Again, this brain drain weighs on the dynamism of Eastern economies, even if money is sent home. Sorry, I'm much over time. This, I'll kind of skip along to the conclusion because I didn't realize I was already at 40 minutes. So this shows this is for the UK, a stylized version of where UK residents live. So in France and Spain, many retirees, and migration, EU migration into the UK, coming very predominantly from Eastern Europe. That's a very stark graphic representation. In Germany, there are 5 million EU nationals currently living and registered in Germany, and the economy added 900,000 workers. It's often said that Germany lacks skilled laborers. There's a lot of talk about IT, nurses, and so forth, but 47% of Eastern migrants actually fill non-skilled positions compared to 16% in the general workforce. Where do we find them? We find them, for example, in the care sector. Germany has 2 million elderly dependent people, and there are about 450,000 basically undeclared Poles and other East Germans as live-in workers. As the authors of one book, recent book on the subject wrote, in Germany the rule is anything goes, which seems to be the norms. There are also workers from farther east, from the Ukraine, Moldavia, Belarus, and Russia. As labor costs rise somewhat in Poland, there's temptation to go further east. And there's a very kind of an invisibilization of this labor in Germany, where much of the discourse is on Syrian and Afghan refugees, on asylum seekers, when actually much of the well-being of German society, whether it is through care, through services, but also their economic successes, rest on this cheaper East European labor, which is, of course, is missing in Eastern Central Europe. So sorry, I mistimed myself a little bit. I wanted to come to some concluding remarks about what put us in the situation we are now. First, the Single European Act created an integrated economic space, but this economic integrated space, to the surprise of Western Europeans, integrates today a vast region with enormous starting points, enormous disparities, and it was just too much to ask of some kind of laissez-faire arrangement for this to rapidly come together. Laissez-faire capitalism was not flanked by a coordinated European social policy. Structural funds, despite there being dozens of billions of euros, when you look at the overall needs and requirements, were not all that important, were actually scaled down compared to the efforts made in Southern Europe. Second, East Europeans were told that freewheeling capitalism, low taxes, and limited state regulation was the only way forward. There was a general expectation that something like the German economic miracle would occur. The problem is that East Germans, but also West Europeans, got basically unfettered capitalism and nothing that resembles the German economic miracle, except perhaps in some urban areas. This was linked with the mass exodus of young and skilled labor and a sharp demographic decline. Western societies were subjected to the disciplining forces of capitalism, so the comforts, the idea that if you work in a factory, you could afford to go on vacation, you could have a sort of middle-class lifestyle, tends to be evaporating, which is part of the Yellow Vest revolt of several years ago. And what can one see as well is that in the West, the loopholes have been multiplied. So the labor laws, the ability for posted workers, the kind of fake independent workers to get out of paying social contributions. Not only does this leave workers vulnerable, in fact in Berlin, most homeless people are East European construction workers who come, have some kind of work accident, don't have any social coverage, get stranded and end up very quickly on the street. But there's also put pressure on the social welfare systems because the whole thing to save labor costs is to get out of paying social contributions. Of course, we're dealing with an aging population populations in which medical expenditures are increasing. So to look forward, just to conclude, I don't think it's in anyone's interest to come back on the free movement of populations within the EU, but I think what is necessary is to rethink some of these labor laws, to try to fix some of these loopholes and these gaps which reinforce this idea of there being first and second class citizens within Europe. This would also require a reinforcement of structural funds. And I wanted to end with, what Europe is maybe missing is some kind of big idea. For the time being, it's just muddling through. We've got the United States on the one hand, China, and Europe is somewhere in between. So what I would think would be important is that Europe tries to redefine its economic and social model. They tried to do it in the 1990s by saying, we're not liberals like the Americans, and we're not, at the time it was the Japanese. We have paid vacations, we don't want people working 90 hours a week. But I think what's important, especially after the pandemic, is that after the pandemic there was this idea of the vulnerability of the supply chains being too long. Europe's actually the only big entity that still believes in free trade. All the other partners don't believe in free trade. We're still the only ones believing in free trade. So I think there's a space after the pandemic to identify key industries, whether it be to produce antibiotics, to produce medical equipment, or to have some big program in the energy transition, which is absolutely vital. The United States is throwing billions at reproducing chips. They're starting to make solar panels again. Europe hasn't done anything of the like. And so if we could imagine something a little bit like Airbus, like a big European project, of course not to make another Airbus, but something that could link together economies, that could provide solidarity, that could provide some type of hope for cleaner growth, and at the same time be some kind of political project with the economic impact that could do something to be something more in lines of cooperation than just pure competition. So perhaps the US election will, with a president who doesn't even pretend to care about Europe, who talks Europe down at every turn, will be a second chance after Europe seems to have squandered the first chance it had in 1990. So maybe to end on that optimistic note, there might be an electroshock. I doubt it, but one can always hope. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for being a little bit overlong.